Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Love of Life podcast. Tonight, we're talking stories, Christian movies, maybe some poetry. We're talking to a screenwriter and the CCO at Lore TV. He's Jason Farley, coming up next.
Christian education, because it serves him who says, I am the way, the truth, and the light, is the love of life.
This is the Love of Life podcast, conversations with Jesse and Courtney. All right, so we are back. Jason, how are you doing tonight?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be on the podcast.
Absolutely. We are really excited to have you as well. There's a lot of different routes I want to go down. I want to talk about Lore TV. I think we need to probably give a little proper brief introduction with that. But I want to talk about you first, because you kind of have a diverse background with different things that you've done. You've done pastoral kind of things. You're a screenwriter. You've gotten into novels. You're a poet. You do lots of poetry. You've been a teacher. So I don't know, maybe briefly you could share with the audience just some of your background. You don't have to give a full autobiography, but just feel free to share and go on for as long as you want. And then we'll stop you if you get bored.
if I get boring, perfect. I mean, so I have bounced around a bit for sure. I was in the ministry for a little over a decade and thought that was kind of the direction my life would go the whole time. And then God threw a left turn into my life with spinal meningitis, which just was a complete full health collapse that took a long time, about 2 years to recover from. And in the process, came out the other side in a different career that it's ended up a writer and have written nonfiction screenplays, both in television and movies, been able to option both, been able to publish some poetry and a couple of novels and nonfiction. And in the process, found myself working mostly amongst creatives, though now my pastoral, my wife likes to say God threw me down a dark alley to find the people in the creative world that needed a pastor too. So so still am an ordained minister and elder in my church and love the church, but now my ministry, so to speak, is amongst other folks working in the creative enterprises, which I love and really enjoy, because a lot of creator folks, especially in the storytelling and music worlds, they don't know where they fit in the kingdom. They have a hard time finding a spot where they can plant their feet in the church. And so I get to do a lot of that, helping creatives find a perch to land on within the church and help them find people to serve there. So which is what I do at Lore. I really like it.
Yeah. So talk about that seed of writing that was planted. Was that during the spinal meningitis episode that you're like, hey, actually, I'm pretty much not feeling well and I'm writing, and actually I want to be a writer with my life. This is what I want to do. Or were you a kid and you were writing lots of stories and things like that? So when did that start for you?
Yeah. So well, as a kid, I wrote music and poetry. That was my where I thought I was going creatively. I started out college as a music major and all that, but then when I became a Christian, a lot of the writing shifted and changed to as I began studying the Bible. It was more of writing as a way to explore what the scriptures say, and that was what I was reading, because I didn't grow up in the church, so I had a lot of catch-up work to do, and I learned by writing. And so I did a lot of nonfiction writing, and that helped when I landed in seminary, and that's what you do there a lot of. But I always continued to work on the poetry, and then started writing stories here and there, just as a way of mostly recording what God was doing in my family and in the ministry, and writing that stuff down. And then when I was coming out of meningitis, it's a funny disease because it squeezes your brain down small, and so you have to relearn a lot of stuff afterwards. I found myself writing my first novel, um, and loving it, because I was just laying there with nothing to do. So I started studying story theory and all of that, and wrote my first novel on pain meds while recovering from
Is
spinal
that novel
meningitis.
published? Is that out there?
It is not. It's sitting in my drawer. It's called Leprechaun Wars. It's about a 30-year-old junior high English teacher who's hikes up a mountain on her 30th birthday to prove she's not old and accidentally catches a leprechaun. And then so she's thrown into a leprechaun witch war that's been going on for generations.
I think that sounds cool. And yeah, it definitely sounds like you were on some kind of dope too,
I
coming with
was,
that kind
I
of story.
was.
That's pretty cool.
That was some good pain meds right there. So
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure you have a question or two out of that.
I do. Actually, what I'd love to know is when and how did you become a Christian?
Well, I
Roller
was
skates.
there
Roller
was
skates.
roller skating involved. I was an argumentative atheist all through junior high, and into high school. And a friend from my soccer team who I hung out with quite a bit, who was a Christian, finally just said, "Hey, you should come visit my church." And I was like, "Well, I'm an atheist, right?" And he said, "Yeah, but we're going roller skating." And I was like, "I do like roller skating." And so the roller skating convinced me to at least come, check out what was going on, and found myself signed up for a retreat and I didn't even know what that was, but they were like, "Hey, put your name down here if you want to go away for the weekend." I was like, "I want to go away for the weekend." So went up to a retreat, and an older guy at my high school who I had known, who was very funny, and that was pretty much what I valued. I was, listening to joke punk and trying to hold the despair at bay with humor. And he had just become a Christian, and he got up and he gave his testimony. And the idea that this guy could seriously consider the faith and religion kind of threw me for a loop, because it was all jokes up till that point, and it shifted him into somebody who was still funny but could be very serious. And so that began my exploration. But like I said, I didn't grow up in the church, so it actually took me a while. I was really intrigued by Jesus, but it took me a while to really understand the gospel. The first time I went into a church was at it was a youth group, and this small redheaded, I thought of her as old. She was probably about 27, I'm guessing. At the time, I thought
When
she
you're
was
a
really
teenager,
old.
that's old.
Exactly. She, we sat down, and she said, "So, do you guys think people are basically good or basically evil?" And I was like, "Well, basically good, obviously." And she said, "Well, then why do you all do things that are so terrible all the time?" And I was like, "Oh, shoot." And my world, and that question started to unravel all of my assumptions about the world, because I started to look around and think, you're right, people are the worst. And I have been telling myself that people are fine. And so then I was like, well, what else is wrong with the way I'm thinking that is patently obvious? G.K. Chesterton calls the sinfulness of man the one objectively observable truth in Christianity. And that was the one that really got me. And it's so that started to unravel, and make me question a lot of other assumptions. And so it was kind of it took me a while to learn what the gospel was, because I hadn't, a lot of people, they get saved, but really they grew up in church and they walked away, and so some church gets to come along and basically save somebody else's kids. I didn't know anything. I thought Jeremiah Was a Bullfrog was a Christian song.
It's not?
It's not, no.
What?
It has all the things, joy, wine,
That's right.
the word Jeremiah, all of those things were like Christian-y church things in my mind. And so I just thought it was a Christian song.
All that's preached at our church.
Right, yeah. Probably by a bullfrog. That's the problem.
Yeah. Doesn't always identify as a bullfrog.
Right. So I just sort of it took me a while to really understand Christianity, and so it was about a year and a half before I was finally baptized. But by then I was, fully in. I had read the Bible. All of the things in the process of becoming a Christian were good. It just was slow because I knew so little. And thankfully met some people that were really patient, let me ask questions, and just let me work through all of the things that I needed to work through before I could even understand enough to say, yeah, I think I should get baptized. Because I went through a period where it's like, I think I'm going to get baptized. And then I have another question, and I go back and be like, wait a second, take me off of the list. I'm not going to get baptized. And thankfully, just the church was really, really patient with me as I worked through all of that stuff, because I was a little bit of a slower convert.
Sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm thorough too, so good. Switching topics a little to talk about stories. The Inklings and Lewis and Tolkien specifically, they wanted to read things that just weren't being written at the time. So, why not just write the type of stuff you want to read? But there's this wonderful quote from a book called The Fellowship, and it kind of captures their idea. It says, a wit may say that the Inklings' aim was to turn the bird into a dragon and the baby into a king, for their sympathies were mythical, medieval, and monarchical, and their great hope was to restore Western culture to its religious roots, to unleash the powers of the imagination, to re-enchant the world through Christian faith and pagan beauty. That was kind of their mission as they were writing different things, what they wanted to do. So how do we capture the imaginations of people through Christian truth, especially in a more and more pagan culture? How do we kind of do what they were aiming to do? And I would argue did.
Right. Well, that's a great book. Because that's the one that walks through Owen Barfield and Charles Williams, and in there he talks about the Great War that Lewis and Barfield had throughout their lives. I'm actually reading a book right now called The Great War that's walking through in more detail what was it Zelensky? Is that the name of the author of that book? I can't remember who wrote that book.
Yeah.
But
yeah. It's a husband and wife duo. Yeah.
Yeah. And what it took for Lewis was a friend that kept challenging his basic assumptions about materialism, right? Because materialism is sort of the great spell that has the West, that the witch put on us. I don't know who the witch would be, but Darwin is kind of the easiest one to point to, although he's downstream a little bit from the original materialists. But the idea being that this world is like a machine is sort of the great lie that keeps people's imagination from being able to even go to the point where they say, what if God, what if Jesus, what if, right? Because because all of that, what that would be considered in a world that is materialistic, in a world that is a clock, a giant clock or a giant machine, all of those things that God has done and Jesus has done and the Spirit has done would be considered magic in that worldview, right? And so because of that, we actually need space made in our imaginations, because our imaginations have been thinned so much by that mythology, the mythology of materialism. And that's where I really think that Christians need to be more involved in the arts in general, but in storytelling in particular, because what Owen Barfield did was just continually question what Lewis and Tolkien came to eventually call the mythopoiesis, but it's the stories that we tell that tell us where we come from and where we fit. Right, the stories that we tell ourselves and that the culture tells about where we come from and where we fit end up defining the parameters of our imagination. And if you watch a movie like E.T., at the beginning of the movie, you get a spaceship that comes down, an alien that comes out, and he runs around, and then the spaceship takes off, and one of the aliens gets left behind. And then it cuts to the story. But it starts by giving us what are called in movie making the outer boundaries of the world. What is, because every movie is a little fantasy, a little fantasy world that's been built. Every novel, every story is a little fantasy world because it works directly on the imagination. It's not real. It's and the outer boundaries of the world that in ET involve spaceships and aliens. So then when you cut to normal life, kids playing, I think they're playing Dungeons and Dragons, if I remember right. It's been a while since I've seen the movie, but they're messing with each other, and the brother's picking on the brother, and it's just normal day in, day out life. You know, okay, this is normal life, but this is the kind of world where an alien might show up at the door. Alien might end up in the bedroom later, right? Which is what eventually happens, right? As you end up, the alien shows up, but you know what kind of world it is because of the outer boundaries that have been set at the beginning of the story. A good filmmaker, that's how they set things up. You know, Jaws is the same. It's the kind of world where a person might get snatched by a shark at the shore, right? That's the kind of world you know you live in Jaws. Well, what the outer boundaries in most people's imagination is set by materialism, right? What could or might happen is set by the myths that we tell about our origin and about the our place in the world. And that's what the church has not done a good job of resisting, because we resist it by telling a more beautiful story. And we have forgotten our own myths, our, capital M myths, true myths, the reality of what kind of world we really live in. We don't read the book of Exodus and see Moses coming in with a magic staff anymore. We retell the story as if it's, and spiritualize it, and we turn it into, instead of an origin myth for our people, which is what it is. We tell the story like we tell the story as if it's a guilt lever. Are you being like Moses? Are you being enough like Moses in your life? Right?
Right.
As if the really important parts of the story all have to do with me and my and whether or not I feel guilty enough about what's I've done wrong. And we've turned it into a story, a moralistic Aesop's fable, maybe. Are you being which kind of person are you being?
Yeah.
Rather than what it is, which is, that's actually the story of the origin of our people. The people of God became a nation through the Red Sea. And so when Paul, in chapter 10 of Corinthians, he says, where'd you come from? Where's your story start? He talks about the creation of the world, the call of Abraham, and Moses taking our people through the Red Sea. But that's our origin story. Our origin story is a wizard with a staff, right? So when we remember that and we tell our story that way, that sets the outer boundaries of what's possible in the world, such that we expect God to be with us everywhere, to show up everywhere, to be hiding. We wouldn't be surprised to discover, even if we didn't see them, but if God whispered to us later, hey, there's angels sitting in the tree over there, we would say, well, yeah, that's the kind of world we live in. Of course there's angels sitting in the tree. They probably followed me after church, because Hebrews tells us that we're taken up with the angels by the power of the Spirit when we gather together for worship. Yeah. Right? The kind of world we live in is angels and demons and God's intervention are all expected, right? They're well within the outer boundaries of this kind of world. So I think we need to learn to retell our own story that way, and then tell the kinds of stories that make that world beautiful. Tolkien did that with Lord of the Rings. I think C.S. Lewis did that with Narnia and with his space trilogy. That the kind of world, and with Till We Have Faces, although it's a little bit more complex of a novel because it's set pre-Christ.
Right.
But that, and I think Chesterton is another example of a writer that does that really well for modern people. Something like The Man Who Was Thursday, which
Hmm.
is a novel about a guy being chased by the police, sort of,
Yeah.
because it also turns out to be a supernatural novel about the real meaning and purpose of each of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. And that's a really great novel. I particularly like, the poem at the very beginning that Chesterton writes to his friend Edward. And it starts with, "A cloud was on the mind of men, and wailing went the weather. Yea, a sick cloud upon the soul when we were boys together." That
Right.
poem is just, it's worth literally just cracking open and reading that. The book's wonderful too. I would advise reading that. But just that opening line poem is good in his time, but super timely for ours as well.
Right. Well, because he understands that you put on, like, we think of costumes as a way, or clothing as a way, dressing up for a holiday, for example. We think of that as telling a lie, right?
Mm,
We're like, oh, I'm covering something up, right? Whereas Chesterton understands the older view that you put on a costume to tell the truth, right?
mm,
That there's a deep glory to each person that you see. There's a deep, a deep glory and a deep beauty, a deep magic underneath the daily life of each person, and the daily life is actually the costume that's telling the lie. Where
mm.
And so on holidays we put on our best clothes, or we dress up in costumes in order to tell the truth about the reality of our humanity, which is that we're, as creatures made in the image of God, we live for eternity and are glory bearers.
Mhm.
Women in a different way than men, women in a more straightforward way. Men are glory transfer stations where we receive it in order to give it to the women in our lives, and women are the glory bearers, in an older understanding of, and I
Yeah.
think an older and more true understanding of our humanity. We're the kinds of creatures that were created in the image of God, which means we can have fellowship with divine Father, Son, Spirit family members.
Mhm.
That's what kind of creature we are. And so our day in, day out life, if you live a life as a plumber, you stick your hands up into places to clean it out. That's uh, in a materialist world. If that's your value to the world, then you bring that with you everywhere, right?
Mhm.
But we don't live in a materialist world. In When that guy puts on a suit for Christmas, that's closer to reality. When he wears a costume on Halloween, that's joyful and fun. That's even closer to reality. In the Middle Ages, they had lots of holidays where they wore costumes. It's not like us where we just have one and we think it's for kids, right?
Right.
But that's because the day in, day out life is a costume, is a costume that we need to remember is
Mhm.
a smaller version of the truth. And
Sure.
that's why the Puritans always wore the big bright colors and everything, is because
Right.
you got to put on display what you are. You're
Yeah.
a flower in God's bouquet.
Would you say that's the correct juxtaposition between the elements of good storytelling? You have ET and the outer boundaries, but then you have the point of origin that we need to remember as humanity of who we really are. Like, what are perhaps maybe some more of the elements of good storytelling? What are those things that we can sort of think about, grapple with as the church?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that makes a lot of Christian storytelling very tepid, and Christian movies um, unfulfilling, is that we actually don't believe in resurrection, and so we're afraid of death. We don't know how to we don't know how to actually charge into the gates of hell in our storytelling, because we don't really believe in resurrection. We also don't know how to hurt our characters the way that God, who loves us, is willing to hurt us to turn us into the people that He intended us to be. Right. So we're if we are clay in his hand, he really digs his thumb in sometimes.
Yeah.
And he says, I've got a plan for you. I'm going to turn you into this kind of pottery. And as the pot, you say, ouch, ouch, ouch. Right? That hurts. And he's like, yeah, but if I don't stick my thumb all the way in, you won't become the wine goblet that can hold that much as much wine as I intend for you to hold. And when I teach my storytelling classes and screenwriting classes, I always say you've got to love your characters enough to really hurt them, right? Because the kind of wisdom, all wisdom is resurrection wisdom. You have to go through death to find it, and all character is resurrection character. If it's truly real character, you have to go through death to get it. And if we're in Christian storytelling, we're often not willing to leave our characters with a limp at the end of the story, because we are willing to hurt them bad enough to transform them into realistically transform them. And if you've got there are filmmakers out there like Judd Apatow, who is a brilliant guy, but he will say, I don't believe that people can change in drastic ways, which is why his movies are about a character just changing a little bit.
Sure.
Right. And, they're always he writes great dialogue. He writes interesting characters, but he doesn't actually believe that people can change very much. And so he writes stories that feel like, well, that guy didn't change that much. And so, sometimes they're still satisfying, but most of the time they're unsatisfying. Most Christian fiction ends up falling into the same category. We don't really believe in significant supernatural changes in people's lives. And so we don't write, we don't send Aragorn through the paths of the dead the way that we need to make a real king.
Yeah.
Did I mix too many metaphors?
No,
I do that
it's
sometimes.
good. We keep it too nice, and it doesn't read true to life.
Nothing Hallmark,
Right.
please.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem is, on the other side, you get the Christian creators that say, we're going to dig into the reality of life, and then there's no resurrection.
Yeah.
And it's the exact same problem without you get the hopeless existentialism on the one hand, and then you get the trite nothing but frosting on the other side. So
Sure.
you rather than finding that good balance between death and resurrection.
Yeah. How does a person's worldview affect their storytelling? I mean, we see this right now. Essentially, we're asking, why do modern movies suck in storytelling? But talk to us a little bit about worldview.
Well, I think this is where one of the things, when I talk to a lot of Christian artists, and one of the things that I like to talk to them about is just their sanctification. Right? How are you growing as a Christian? Because you grow as the way that you grow as a Christian is going to affect your art, because good art is something that really flows out of the artist, right? The same way that when you get to the end of the creation week, and you look back, and every single thing that God created can be, the way Augustine puts it is, he says that every single beauty is a stream that flows from the beauty of God, and by faith you can swim up the stream of any beauty to get to the beauty of God, right? Everything that God created that is true and that is good and is beautiful is a rivulet that leads back to the rushing river of God's goodness. So our art as people made in the image of God works the same sort of way. So what you believe about the Lord with our worldview, as well as what you are living, which is also a significant part of our worldview, although we like to separate them out because it's easier to, because it's all of that flows out into our art if you're trying to be truthful. And so what a Christian artist should be doing is getting as good at their craft as they can and getting as good at being a Christian as they can at the same time, trying to grow both in their faith and in their craft, knowing that when the craft is working properly, then it is your worldview flowing out into the art and filling it with its content. It doesn't fill it with its craft. You have to actually work on the craft of whatever art you're working on and get better at it, whether it's writing or poetry or acting or directing or cinematography or photography or whatever it is. There, you have to learn the craft by studying the greats and studying the experts and practicing and all of that. I can't remember who said it now, but somebody said to become a good poet, you have to write 1,000 bad poems to get them out of your system. And all art is like that. So you have to work on the craft, and then you have to work on really knowing and understanding the truth and living it out, so that you can have the wisdom to be able to tell a great story. So, you trying to think of who a good example of this would be. I mean, Tolkien, I think, is actually a really good example of this. He was constantly trying to grow in his faith. If you read his letters, he writes to his son about what the sermon was about, what he learned from the sermon this week. That sort of thing. He's trying to grow in the Lord. He talks to his son about when his son moves, make sure whatever house you decide is close to a parish where you'll get where that the priest is faithful, right? So you're going to be able to go to church and he's responding to something his son said apparently about the pastor's has a nasally voice wherever he landed, and he says it's probably good for your soul because it's easy to feel moved by the pastor's words and forget to take in the truth of the scripture if you've got a great orator for a pastor. So he's always trying to grow in his faith and grow in the Lord, and that really ends up significantly and deeply influencing his art, because he wants to he's trying to help England restore he wants England to be restored to a mythology that has room for God's work and salvation of the people of England, of the people of the UK, really, when you get down to it, because he was a monarchist. So right. Everyone under the crown. He thought that modernism had done such a terrible thing to the imagination of the people of the UK that there wasn't space for them to think of the UK having a mission from God to bring light to the world the way in previous generations they thought about themselves that way. And he said it's because we've retold the mythology. And so he's trying to write a new mythology for the English people that makes room for a supernatural intervention by the creator God. Right. And so that's all flowing. As he thinks deeply about what the English people need, he ends up writing The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which I think is an example of a absolutely perfect novel. That there's nothing extra in it, and there's nothing that is nothing unnecessary and nothing that it's needed. It's a perfect novel, and that's because he wants to serve the Lord with his art, and because he's thought so deeply about what is it that art is for and what does it do. So,
well, you might have just answered part of this question actually with that answer, but what kind of influence does story have on people? Obviously, that's a great example of a good influence that it has on people, but we also see a culture captivated by the wrong kind of stories. So just, I guess, the potency of story.
Yeah. Well, I can give a good personal example with this one. I didn't grow up going to church, but I grew up with a great librarian at my public elementary school who gave me Narnia when I was young and gave me Tolkien when I was young. And then I also had a mom who was willing to drive me to the library anytime I asked and she would let me fill up on books from the library, and I read a lot as a young kid. And I got, because of Lewis, I got into Tolkien, and because of that, I got into King Arthur, and so I read a lot of King Arthur as a young man, and that informed my understanding of nobility, masculinity, strength, all of those sorts of things. And when in the sixth grade I declared myself an atheist, I was sad that I knew that Reepicheep was no longer on my side. Right? I got really into Freud in the eighth grade, and I was reading Freud in the eighth grade and the ninth grade, and um, and my favorite novel of all time was, and it's still up in my top 10, is Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And there's this part where where Eustace Scrubb, who almost deserves his name, Lewis says.
I think he did deserve it.
Yeah,
I think he deserved
it. That he is whining about why is it that Lucy gets everything, and he and Reepicheep takes out his sword, and he with the flat end of his sword, he's giving stripes to the rear end of Eustace, and for being for not being a knight, or for not taking the vows of knights seriously, for not putting women first. And I remember reading Freud and trying to explain to some girl, you and me, baby, we ain't nothing but mammals. And realizing that Reepicheep would run me through and throw me overboard. Like, I don't have a place on the Dawn Treader anymore. And that was tragic because of the way that the works had affected my imagination. I knew I was losing something beautiful. I didn't understand the relationship between that and Jesus, but I knew that I was moving away from the things that I loved because of their beauty. The Knights of the Round Table, there was no spot being saved for me anymore at the Knights of the Round Table. Freud doesn't get a spot with the Knights of the Round Table. He's one of the Black Knights that needs to be skewered and rescued all of the maidens that he has locked up in his basement. The storytelling, it explains to us how goodness is beautiful. What about good storytelling shows us how goodness is beautiful? And the argument for both truth and for goodness, one of the central arguments is that it's beautiful. It's the most beautiful. True goodness is truly beautiful. And that was Dante. His spiritual life begins when as he gets older, he comes back and retells the story in a more mature way. But his baby Justin Bieber version of his young life spiritual awakening was when he sees his neighbor Beatrice as a woman for the first time, and not just as a girl down the road. When the beauty, and when he approaches her, and he was a young man, but he's 9 years old or 11 years old, something like that. And he approaches her and says, "Hi, Beatrice, I'd love to shake your hand," because he's now all of a sudden going through puberty, and puberty in the Middle Ages, puberty was considered a spiritual as well as a physical awakening. We've lost that all completely. But when she says, "You're being weird, Dante," and doesn't shake his hand back, he goes home and cries and writes a sonnet about his grief. And but when he goes back and says why, she says, "Because you don't care about virtue. You don't want to serve God. Why would I be interested in you as somebody to as a potential husband?" And it kicks open the doors that, oh my gosh, to be near that beauty, I have to learn to be virtuous. I have to learn to be good. And he comes to understand later, like like a more mature version of Justin Bieber singing "Holy, Holy." He comes to understand later that God was using beauty to draw him towards goodness,
Mm,
right? And that's actually the normal way. That goodness is actually a more beautiful way to live. It's a more fulfilling way to live, and that's the normal way that we're drawn to goodness is not necessarily through rational argumentation. C.S. Lewis calls it he calls it intellectual backfill. We
mm,
start by being attracted to goodness because it's beautiful.
Mm.
Later, we explain rationally why it is. He says, but it's all intellectual backfill. The
yeah.
beauty of it is what actually draws our heart towards it in the first place. And then later we explain why it was that we made such a good rational decision. Like
Yeah.
we rarely make decisions because they're reasonable, right?
Yeah.
Our heart leaps towards something, and then later we're like, this is why it was the right thing, or this is why it was the wrong thing. Sometimes, often as well.
Yeah.
But that, like Lewis's understanding of intellectual backfill, has helped me a lot in understanding my own motivations and what kind of stories I want to tell and write about.
Yeah.
So did
Yeah.
that answer your question?
Yeah, that was awesome. That was awesome.
I'm sure if we sat down and we looked at each other's bookshelves, we'd probably be like, okay, there's a lot of crossover here, litany of authors who have told good stories over the centuries. And you've obviously mentioned, we've all mentioned two of them now, Lewis and Tolkien. But who in your mind is on a large scale telling good stories now? Or do you see this huge, I know that right now you're writing stories and others like you, but is there kind of this void almost at the moment? Do we have a Lewis and Tolkien sort of in their own vein, or are we missing that? Do we need that, or do we need something else? I know I've just asked like three questions in a row, but
Yeah.
go ahead.
I mean,
Go ahead.
so I would say, you've got some guys that are doing some great work. I think Louis Sachar, he wrote Holes, the Card Turner. He's written them. He's doing a good job in terms of meeting kids where they're at in suburbia. And another really really great author. He wrote the Wednesday Wars. He why is his name escaping me? He is, I think, he might be the best current Christian author who is doing the same sort of, that's doing something similar to Narnia, in that it's imagination expanding. Why is his name
It's
escaping
not
me?
S.D. Smith, is it? It's not S.D. Smith, is it?
No, S.D. Smith is a good example. He's doing a really good job, as well as his brother, or I don't know, not his brother, but a guy that publishes with him, Andrew. Andrew. This is I can't remember authors unless they've been dead 50 years. That's
Yeah, us too. It's okay.
Peterson and Andrew Peterson.
Okay.
He's writing at a little bit lower level, kind of early Narnia, or like early the first Harry Potter. I think the Harry Potter novels, as a whole, they do a good job at this kind of Rowling. Was very influenced by Tolkien and Lewis in particular, in her understanding of storytelling. I wish I could think of who wrote the Wednesday Wars.
Hey, I'll look it up for you.
Yeah, that'd be great. He is a phenomenal author, and he does a lot of taking into account how dislodged modern teenagers feel, and he starts there. So he starts with characters that feel very dislodged from reality, and he helps them find their way back into reality. In wonderful storytelling. The and Wednesday Wars is, he uses Shakespeare to help a young teenager rediscover what it is to be a part of reality again.
And that's Gary Schmidt. Gary Schmidt.
Gary D. Schmidt. Yes, I really love Gary D. Schmidt's novels. I've
not heard of him, so I'm excited.
Yeah, he's fantastic. He's a great writer. And he understands really well the modern teenager's experience of dislodgement. And social media has just expanded and encouraged it and tried to convince everybody that it's normal, but it's not. It's not normal to be dislodged from reality, to feel like you're floating above your own life, to feel like you're sitting in the balcony watching your own life happen. That's not normal, but it is the normal experience of most teenagers right now. And Gary D. Schmidt does a really good job of helping re-lodge teenagers and adults, for that matter, back into reality with his writing. He's out at, I think he's at Wheaton.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. Would you say that the stories, the movies that are coming out right now, are those predominantly a reflection of society, or the ethos of executive producers, the elite, the stuff they want us to embrace, sort of you can call it wokeism, you can call it paganism, you've said materialism. There's a lot of isms going on and have been going on for a long time. But what would you say is sort of the crux of the stories that are coming out now, with a 115-pound woman knocking out 3 macho dudes with machine guns? Doesn't seem quite. I mean, I like to be enchanted and I like fairy tales, but that's a little bit more of a stretch than even is the crux of reality. They're trying to lead over something that's not true. They're telling a lie about the world, right?
Yeah, right. And we'd actually probably be better off with paganism than what it is that they're actually pushing, because unfortunately it's not even good old-fashioned paganism, which we know how to convert pagans. The church has been doing that for 2,000 years. We have a much harder time converting robots, which is what people have been convinced they are now. That they're a machine that functioning in a world that is a machine. That's something we haven't really figured out how to help people out of mentally with the gospel. We will. The church. The Spirit of God is much more insistent that the church learn how to convert its neighbors than we generally are. But I would say that the biggest problem right now is that you have, and in storytelling, that you have separated out the storytellers from reality. A lot of people from LA don't realize the rest of the world exists. I was talking to one guy who was working on a film. He was the photographer, just taking back end the photos, behind the scenes photos, for marketing purposes later and such. And I get a phone call from him, and he says, "Hey, I'm working on this film, and the pastor there's a pastor that's a main character." And I told this director, "Hey, your pastor doesn't sound very much like a pastor." And he said he'd never met a pastor. And so he said, "So I gave him your number. I just so in case your phone rings, I said, hey, well, I can connect you with one." And this guy wasn't a Christian. It's just a guy that I know that I've worked with before. And he knew that I had been a pastor, and he knew that this character didn't talk at all like the conversations I'd had with him about Christianity. And so he's like, "So I gave him your phone number. So if he calls, and later he called, and he said, "Oh, the guy told me he wasn't going to call because he said he'd watched enough Fox News to know how a pastor spoke."
Those aren't my pastors.
No, I know, mine neither. But for whatever, but this guy, he's separated from normal folks, but he had a big budget to make a big money drama.
Yeah.
And so I think that that there really is a separation between the quote unquote elites and just normal everyday folks. And about 100 years ago, G.K. Chesterton wrote a book called My Visit to America. And he says Americans' biggest temptation is that they're going to turn their millionaires and their film stars into gods and goddesses. So they're going to.
He's so
It's
prescient.
a-
He saw it.
So 100 years ago, he said, in 100 years, they will worship their millionaires and their movie stars, and he's right. Right? I mean, we call them stars.
Yeah.
We could like they guide and direct the heavens, and the that mentality hasn't been good for the soul of America, and it's not. So we have elites guiding us around that are disconnected, but it's not really their fault. I mean, some of them, they're going to have to answer for what they did with it. I mean, all of them are going to have to answer, but the some of them have used it for evil on purpose. A lot of them are just not very smart.
Right.
There's, I don't know how else to put it, but they so the storytelling mechanisms have all been conquered by people with an agenda. So whether it's there, there are some people that haven't, like there was a movie that just came out. It's by the two brothers that that make really goofy movies, and it's called Hail Caesar.
Oh yeah, right. The Coen brothers.
The Coen brothers, yeah. I think they're a good example of something that has not been conquered by Hollywood, because the Hail Caesar was a hilarious movie about communists taking over Hollywood.
Right.
And they refuse to make any comment. Right? They make this movie and they're like, no, the movie is our comment. We will make no comments about communists in Hollywood. And it's so funny. And the George Clooney plays this clueless actor who just doesn't realize he's being used by the communists, and it's hilarious.
Yeah.
But at one point, they're walking through and they're handing out lunches, and the above the line gets one kind of lunch, and below the line gets another kind of lunch, and so the main characters, all are being brought a fancy lunch, and it's this scene where Jesus is being crucified, and all you see is his feet. And he walks up, and the guy's saying, "Hey, handing out lunches." And he stops and he says, looks up at Jesus, and he says, "Are you a main character in this?" And he goes, "I don't." And he says, "I don't know." And you realize, like, the Coen brothers are skewering Hollywood just right through the heart. It's amazing. And so for whatever reason they can still get away with it, and that's a really funny movie.
Yeah.
But we went, my wife and I saw it in the theaters, and we were dying laughing the whole time, and nobody else was. I don't think anybody else got it. So it was right over the head of most of the people in the audience. So lots of funny communist jokes.
That's funny.
What types of stories should we be telling? Should we be wanting?
Well, one of the things that's great about the current present is that all of the genres are up for grabs, because we don't have. I mean, we'll see if in 20 years if snuff films come back in, and there's I guess pornography would be off the table, but that we don't think of that as a genre because of the influence. Yeah, because of the influence of Christianity. The current breakdown of storytelling into the particular genres we have right now is from a previous Christian age of storytellers. So really all the genres are on the table still for Christian storytellers to get hold of and take dominion in and tell true stories with. So I think we need Christian sci-fi, Christian fantasy, Christian action movies, Christian. I'd love to see the return of the knights and castles. That has been a genre that's just been, I think, because we don't believe in virtue anymore. We have a really hard time telling stories that center on meeting virtuous characters. But I think that all we have to do right now is tell stories where men act like men and women act like women, and we're revolutionaries. We're restoring order to a world of chaos. It's not that hard at this point. in time. It just takes, I think, courage, which we do unfortunately lack a lot of courage.
We do.
But I think, because they are going to, come after us. We've got a movie in our pipeline at Lore TV called The Lesbian and the Lumberjack.
Mm.
That is about a woman. It's a Christmas rom-com about a woman who thinks she's a lesbian, but it turns out she's just never met a real man. Right?
All right, this is a good transition. Talk to us about Lore TV and your position there.
Right. So I'm the chief content officer. Excuse me. Which means I'm the one going out and trying to find the filmmakers that we're because Lore is a funding and distribution platform, and so I'm trying to find the filmmakers that are ready to make or have already made movies that don't fit in Hollywood because they're too Christian, but they don't really fit in the faith-based, quote unquote, faith-based world because they're not Hallmarky enough. So we're trying to show, find the Christians that are working in all the other genres besides Hallmark, and give them the freedom, just because there's already, you can already go get your Hallmark movie made.
Of course.
But give them the freedom to love God, make this and tell the stories they want to tell. And as we found, the Christian artists are there, and a lot of them have been working hard on their craft. There's just nobody that has the courage to say, hey, let's make that movie that you want to make. And The Lesbian and the Lumberjack is a good example that when I tell people about that, Christian, non-Christian alike, every once in a while somebody will be offended. Most people laugh, they get it, they think it's funny. And then I get all the time people saying, I know a story like that. I have a friend that she thought she was a lesbian, but it turned out that all the men in her life were just still boys. And so she never found any of them attractive because they all acted like little boys. I had a bartender. I'm infamous for stopping a whole bar room and saying, "Hey, I'm working on a movie. Can I pitch it to you guys?" And and I did that with The Lesbian and the Lumberjack in a bar in downtown Spokane at about 11:30 or 11:30 at night. So everybody was hanging around, and they all laughed, and a couple people came up to me and said, "Hey, when's that coming out?" And I said, "Oh, just keep an eye on Lore TV." And well, the bartender at the end, he pulled me aside and he said, "I'm here day in and day out, and I can tell you that most of the women that try out, like, quote unquote, they test out being a lesbian, it's because all of the men in here are still boys."
Wow.
Right? They all play video games, live at home with their mom, work part-time, and don't take a full-time job, don't have a career, and then they come down to the bar to pick up girls, and all of the women are more mature than them, and so he said, "So you have to make that movie because it will give hope to so many women."
Yeah.
And I was like, there you go. The bartender Chris, who used many four-letter words in his explanation of that to me.
Sure.
He says, "Please make that movie. The women in my bar need it."
The knights in shining armor are way too busy at home playing PS4 at their mom's
exactly.
house.
Exactly.
Crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. So but what we're trying to do at Lore is prove out that Christian filmmakers can work in every genre and tell great stories in every genre. And what moves a culture is not one movie that is good, right? It's we often lose the culture wars because we don't have a culture. We don't have our own stories. We don't have our own movies. We don't have our own television shows that leak out to the rest of the culture. The reason you don't get the Cosby, things like the Cosby Show, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, that what they showed the world was that Black folks had a culture that they loved, and that you can come and join them and be invited into their culture. And so the reason that they had such a cultural impact, even though they're 13-14% of the population has had such a cultural impact, was because they have a culture in the middle of a land full of people that don't have cultures,
Yeah.
right? Um, and the American Evangelical Church is one of those people groups that doesn't really have a culture, and so we're hoping to build up the movies and the television um, aspect, storytelling aspect of the culture of the modern American church, because the filmmakers are there. There's
Yeah.
some really talented filmmakers that have had to work in the secular world because they want to do a good job.
Yeah, yeah. Give the listeners a little bit more of a taste as far as what they would expect if they go to Lore TV right now. What kind of works or what kind of things can they see at the moment potentially? And then you can talk a little bit more, if you can, about your pipeline, some ideas of what else they might, maybe other kind of genres that Lore TV might be producing.
Yeah, yeah. So right now we've got some TV shows up there that are being chosen between by our current audience. So how it works is when you subscribe, you get to help choose what goes on to the streaming platform. So we've built a gamified system, and you get a certain amount of internal currency. We call it loot to spend on the projects that you want to see go on the platform. And when something reaches its funding goal, then it begins to stream and everybody can watch it. So right now we've got shows like Barely Biblical, which it's a children's cartoon about stuffed animated teddy bears acting out the most violent stories of the Old Testament. It's really, really good. and more than 50% of the dialogue in the cartoon is straight scripture being read. So it's the kind of show that kids are going to want to watch a bunch of times in a row because it's funny and it's hilarious and it's really, really well done. But also they're going to walk away having giant chunks of the Book of Samuel memorized and the Book of Judges. So the most violent stories of the Old Testament acted out by animated stuffed teddy bears. So we've got
That's
that
so
one.
much better. That's so much better than Veggie Tales. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, it really is. It's fantastic.
It's great.
We have a great show. It's comedian Joseph Granda traveling the country, breaking the most ridiculous laws that he can find and turning himself into the cops. It's called Breaking Laws, and it's a reality show that's highlighting how we've got some really ridiculous laws. And then at the end of each episode, he goes to a pastor in that town and asks if he broke Romans 13. So it's just such a funny show. We have a show called The Psalter that is experimental short fiction based on different psalms. So the filmmaker takes a psalm and he writes a short fictional piece highlighting the psalm and trying to use the words of the psalm as the structure for his storytelling. That one's really neat. We have a couple of really great documentary called Gothics about a Twitch streamer who a black goth Twitch streamer who had a really big following, who dared to say that it might not be racism that for the reason that somebody opposes the new Little Mermaid casting. And she got canceled really hard, lost all of her sponsors, got kicked out of all sorts of Twitch groups and everything. And a Christian filmmaker said, "Hey, can I tell your story?" And in the process, she and her boyfriend end up becoming Christians in the process of the movie. It's a beautiful, amazing documentary.
Wow.
It's a really, my 18-year-old daughter watched it and said, "Dad, every teenager in the country needs to see this. We need to understand what's going on with cancel culture." And you don't, unless somebody tells you, you don't know, because they keep it pretty invisible. So that's a really amazing one. We've got a really, really interesting docuseries called Your American Family about the a family in Tennessee that had a flag store that got flagged, quote unquote, by PayPal as a terrorist group. It's a true story.
Wow.
And what ended up happening, that they ended up being targeted by Google, and and Homeland Security and the FBI and all these different groups started showing up at their doors. It's a crazy story about and it was all the day after the January 6th when they started saying these people are radicals who need to be put in jail. And it was and it's just about how big tech has been weaponized by the left. And so that's an amazing story that I couldn't believe it when I sat down with this. Just he's just a dad he and his son make and sell American flags, and that's what got them flagged as a terrorist organization. It's so you get sitting there, you thinking this can't be true, and then he shows you the video of it all happening. It's an amazing story. So we've got just really great content, and then in the pipeline we've got sci-fi. We've got a really great Western actually right now called Black Rose Ballad. That's just really fantastic, hyper violent, manly Christian Western.
Awesome.
It's amazing. So we've got in the pipeline, we've got sci-fi, we've got fantasy, we've got comedy, we've got a lot of great comedy. One of the comedies we've got right now on the front page is called Churchville, and it's a comedy similar to The Office or Key and Peele, about two mega churches across the street from one another in Tennessee, in Nashville, competing for who's going to be the best mega church. It's just so funny, right? Where you just get a really good laugh at ourselves, right? Like the church could be really goofy right now, but it's not. I mean, it's by a man that loves the church, and he just wants it to be better. And he says there's no better way than to laugh at your own if you have a good laugh at the dumb things you do, you're less likely to do them again.
Right.
So
there you go. Well, where can people find out more about you, some of the works that you've written, and Lore TV? It's LOOR.TV, right?
Yeah, LOOR.TV is that's where you go to sign up, and then you can find my books on Amazon, and then I podcast at Knox Unplugged weekly. Have a podcast on storytelling, poetry, and the Christian life, and which sometimes is really long, but it's a lot of fun. As you can tell by the fact that I'm still talking to you.
Oh, it's been great.
It's been
we
great.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Jason, it's been a sincere pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Love of Life podcast, Conversations with Jesse and Courtney.
It is our duty through our schools to create a new one, a God-centered one. We are told in Proverbs 8, verses 35 and 36, "For whoso findeth me findeth life, and shall obtain favor of the Lord. But he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death."